Today we're going to begin triangle congruence proofs. This is going to be a 2-day event. So a few things you should know. These are some tips to help you with these proofs. Okay, 1, it takes 3 things to prove 2 triangles congruent, or 2 if you're using hypotenuse leg. Remember our triangle congruence postulates and theorems. We had side, 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 angle, side, angle, side, angle, 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 side, and hypotenuse leg. So we're going to be looking to use these to prove triangles congruent. The second thing is, if the 2 triangles share a side or an angle, you can use the congruence, and the reason is the reflexive property. So if they share a side, you could say that it's congruent to itself, and the reason is the reflexive property. Number 3 says, if the prove statement is something other than a triangle congruence statement, then you might have to prove 2 triangles congruent, then use CP/CTC. You'll find that that's the case in most of your triangle congruence proofs. The 4th tip is, if a midpoint is given, you can say the 2 pieces are congruent by the midpoint theorem. The 5th tip, if you know that 2 angles of one triangle are congruent to 2 angles of another triangle, then you can say that the third angles are congruent by the third angle theorem. We don't use that very often, but it could be very useful. The 6th tip is, if you use vertical angles, you state the congruent statement. So you'll say this angle is congruent to that angle, and then the reason is that vertical angles are congruent. So if I were you, I'd put these 6 tips on a separate piece of paper so that you can reference these over and over as you're trying to do some of these proofs. Let's go through a few examples together. Now, the first thing you need to remember is the types of proofs. We talked about these a while ago. We talked about 2 column. Remember, you have statements and reasons. We did not talk about paragraph. So paragraph just means that you're writing every thought process, every statement, and every reason, but you're writing it in sentence form. And then flow proofs are my favorite. You put your statements in boxes, and your reasons are written below it, and you're actually taking arrows and showing where things are coming from and what you're assuming or what you're getting from these statements. Alright, so example 1 says, write a 2-column proof. So the first thing you always want to do is you want to take your given and you want to mark on your picture what's given. So first we have that LM is congruent to LO. So we'll mark LM congruent to LO. The second thing we're given is that MN is congruent to ON. So now we're trying to prove that these 2 triangles are congruent because that's what our prove statement says. Now, if we think back to what we did yesterday, we could say that these 2 triangles are congruent by side, side, side. Because, look, they share this third side, and that means that it's congruent to itself. So, we just kind of talked through this proof. So you always start with your statement as your given. So your first statement is we're going to say that LM is congruent to LO. And we're also going to say that MN is congruent to ON. And over here, you number your reason, and you just say given, because that's given to you. Now, you don't have to lump together all your givens in one statement. You could save one for later. It doesn't matter. But if you can go ahead and put it all in one, that's fine too. Now, think back to our tip. I'm going to go back to these tips. It says that, number 2 says, if the 2 triangles share a side or an angle, you can use this congruence, and the reason is the reflexive property. So we just said that it shares LN. So our statement is we're going to say that LN is congruent to itself. And our reason, based on the tip, is we're going to write reflexive property. Now we have all 3 things that we need to prove that our 2 triangles are congruent. We have this side, and this side. You can highlight them if you want to. You don't have to. But I like to highlight the 3 things that are proving them congruent. Because I have those 3 things congruent, now I can write that triangle LMN is congruent to triangle LON. Now, your reason is side, side, side. Because that's what we talked about up here. Your reason is never prove or proof. Okay? So there's our first one. We did a 2-column. Okay, let's take a look at example 2. This one says we're going to write a paragraph proof. So, the first thing we want to do is take our given and put it on our picture and see what sense we can make out of it. So, we know that AB is congruent to BE. So, we'll mark those congruent. And we also know that angle A is congruent to angle E. Now, once we have that, let's take a look at our proof statement. Our proof statement isn't a triangle congruence statement. We're trying to prove that this segment is congruent to this segment. But in order to do that, we've got to prove the 2 triangles congruent first. So let's figure out how we can prove these 2 triangles congruent. Well, if you take a look here, we have some vertical angles. This angle and this angle are vertical, and we know that vertical angles are always congruent. Now we have enough information to say that these 2 triangles are congruent. These 2 triangles are congruent by angle, side, angle. Now notice that side is between those 2 angles. Okay, so let's start our paragraph proof. We're going to say it is given that AB is congruent to BE. And angle A is congruent to angle E. So there's our 2 things that were given to us. The third thing to prove our triangle is congruent was the fact that we had vertical angles. We're going to say that angle ABD is congruent to angle EBC, and because this is our reason, vertical angles are congruent. Ooh. Now we've got those 3 things to say that our triangles are congruent. So we need to come up with our own triangle congruence statement because it's not given to us. So if I name the first triangle ABD, what corresponds to that is triangle EBC. So we're going to say these 2 triangles are congruent because of, and our reason was angle, side, angle. Okay, so now the last thing we got to do is we got to say our proof statement. So because these 2 triangles are congruent, we can say that AD is congruent to EC. So we're going to say AD is congruent to EC because, and we can use abbreviation here, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So because of CPCTC. And we are done. Okay, so let's look at another example. This one says to write a flow proof. These are my favorite type. So the first thing we want to do is take our given and put it on our picture. So we got some midpoints here. So it says T is the midpoint of PR. If T is the midpoint of PR, then we can say that this segment, PT, is congruent to this segment, TR. The other given says that T is the midpoint of QS. So we can say that this segment is congruent to this segment. So we're trying to prove that PQT is congruent to triangle RST. So we've got a couple of triangles in here, so we want to make sure we're proving the right ones congruent. So PQT, that's this one. And we're trying to prove that it's congruent to RST. Now, we've got 2 sides. The last thing you need one more piece of information. So if you take a look, we actually have a set of vertical angles. So we can say that these two are congruent because they are vertical angles. So now we can say that these two triangles are congruent by, this is going to be a side angle side proof. So let's do our flow chart. Now when you do the flow chart, you cannot group together the given. So the first thing we're going to write is T is the midpoint of PR. T is I'm going to use some abbreviations so I'm not writing as much. T is the midpoint of PR. And that is a statement, so I'm going to put a box around it. And my reason goes below it, and my reason is given. Now, I'm going to go ahead and write what we got from the fact that this was a midpoint. So let's go back to our tips for just a moment. So it says, number 4, if a midpoint is given, then you can say that the two pieces are congruent, and your reason is the midpoint theorem. So because we said that T was the midpoint of PR, we could say that PT was congruent to TR. So from this, we're getting that PT is congruent to TR. You see how this arrow, this statement comes from that statement. And your reason? Midpoint theorem. Use abbreviations. Midpoint theorem. And that's one of the pieces that we need to prove the triangle congruent. So let's do the other given. The other given says T is the midpoint of QS. So we're going to start at like a new column. So that's our statement, so it goes in a box. And the reason for that one is given. Now from that, just like the other one, we're going to say that QT is congruent to TS. My reason, just like before, is midpoint theorem. And that's another thing that I need to prove the two triangles congruent. So I need one more thing. And we looked at the picture and we discovered that we had some vertical angles. So we're going to say that angle QTP is congruent to angle STR. And that's a statement. And our reason is vertical angles are congruent. And we use symbols. So that's our third thing that we need. Now we have all three things. And at the bottom, we're going to write our triangle congruent statement. We're going to say that triangle, PQT is congruent to triangle RST. Now, this is our statement, and it's very important where we draw the arrows from. We used this thing, and this thing. So every triangle congruent statement, unless we're talking about a right triangle, has 3 arrows drawn to it because it takes 3 things to prove a triangle congruent. And our reason is side angle side. Okay, so here's some classwork. It says write any type of proof. So you can pick between 2-column, paragraph, or flow, whatever you're the most comfortable with. So the first one says given QR is congruent to RS, and we have angle QRP is congruent to angle SRP. So then we're going to prove two triangles congruent. So remember to mark all of your given on your picture first, and then decide, is there anything else from the picture you can get to get 3 things to prove the triangle's congruent. Now number 2, we've got 2 midpoints, so we've got to use the midpoint theorem. And then we're trying to prove that angle K is congruent to angle O. Now, this time, on this one, you've got to prove 2 triangles congruent first. And then, remember, if you've got a proof statement that's something other than a triangle congruent statement, you're going to use CPCTC at the end. Good luck.